People have four basic motivations: reward, ideology, coercion, and ego.
Eu também não sabia o que realmente era manipulação, até ouvir essa gente da CIA revelar essas técnicas ultra secretas para fazer qualquer pessoa depender de você a ponto de fazerem qualquer coisa por você.
And that is worth just as much as getting people to do what you want them to do.
André Bultamonte é um oficial reformado da CIA, que usa habilidades de espiões para ensinar qualquer pessoa a dominar a sua mente e os seus talentos na vida e nos negócios. Por isso mesmo, neste vídeo, vamos descobrir juntos como os espiões da CIA manipulam qualquer pessoa para coletar os seus segredos mais profundos. Estás preparado?
If you want to manipulate people, you will learn that from this conversation.
As part of your training to become a CIA officer, you must have learned how to manipulate people. That seems to me, from what I know of spies, pretty foundational to what it is to be a successful spy and to get information from someone else. In this conversation today, are we going to learn how, through your training, you were taught get information from people and make them do what you wanted them to do?
Yes, and I'll be very frank here. I try to exercise something called radical transparency. If you want to manipulate people, you will learn that from this conversation. If you want to manipulate people, I will teach you how to manipulate people. In just a simple conversation, you can learn those skills. But the thing to understand that's the most important is that whether you want to manipulate or not, others are manipulating you just because you don't know what they're doing, right? The problem with being an intelligence operator is that to achieve the things you have to achieve, you sometimes have to do things that you don't want to do. In being a business owner, what I've discovered is that many business owners struggle because they feel like they have to do things they don't want to do. They feel like they have to be sleazy. They feel like they have to be tricky. They feel like they have to mimic, shyster, bad guy business owners, right? The flip side, if you think of a coin, one side of that coin is manipulation. And that coin has value. Manipulation has value. But the other side of the same coin is motivation. If you can get people to do what they want to do, then you have motivated them. And that is worth just as much as getting people to do what you want them to do, which is manipulating them. And there are a number of processes that we learned that had to do with human psychology. One of those processes is understanding the idea of core motivations. Core motivations are, remember how we talked about manipulation and motivation are two sides of the same coin? When you understand all the different options of the currency that you're working with, you can work with it more effectively. So people are generally, despite age, race, creed, or religion, people have four basic motivations. And we call those four basic motivations RICE, R-I-C-E, stands for reward, ideology, coercion, and ego. Reward is anything that you want. Money, free vacations, pat on the back, women, alcohol. If that's something that you want and me giving it to you gives you what you want, then that's a reward. People do lots of crazy things for rewards.
And these rewards change over time?
And based on person.
Okay.
Right? The second primary motivator is ideology. Ideology is the things that you believe in. People do crazy things for the things they believe in, whether it's their religion, whether it's their country, whether it's family, whether it's what they believe is morally correct, right? So if you can speak to somebody through the lens of their ideology, you can get them to do incredible things. C is coercion. Coercion is all the negative things: guilt, shame, blackmail, anything that you do to force someone to take certain action by leaning into the negative element of motivation, which is also known as manipulation. That falls under the C, or coercion. And then E, ego, is everything that has to do with how the person views themselves. So oftentimes ego gets oversimplified into thinking that it's just people who have a big ego, right? Somebody like Donald Trump who has a big ego, or you name the famous actor who has a big ego. Ego is also people who don't have big egos. Mother Teresa had an ego. She wanted to sacrifice for other people. She wanted other people to see her sacrificing for other people. That is also ego. So with these four core motivations, you have a rubric, a process to understand why other people do what they do. If you understand why other people do what they do, all you have to do is connect what they care about with what you want them to do, and you just increase the probability of them doing what you want them to do.
Of these four core motivations, are is there an order of the strength that they have over people? So if you were really trying to get someone to do something, you'd focus on this core motivation over that one.
Yes, absolutely. Ideology is the strongest. Ego is the second strongest. Reward is the third strongest, and coercion is the weakest. This is one of the things that movies get wrong. Movies try to make it look like you can blackmail somebody or hold a gun to their head and get them to do what you want them to do. In the real world, once you hold a gun to someone's head, they never trust you again. You can never get them to do something twice. Whereas if you appeal to their ideology, doing this is good for your country, doing this is good for your family, doing this is good for your health. If you can appeal to someone's ideology, they'll do what you tell them to do for a long time because they'll trust you.
Is this really the essence of manipulation then?
That is the essence of motivation and manipulation, the same coin. You'll hear me come back to this because one of the things that people really struggle with outside of intelligence is they feel like they have to label things as good or bad. When you have moral flexibility, you take away good and bad. Everything just becomes a question of utility or productivity. If you need someone to do something and you can motivate them, then you should. But if you need someone to do something and you can't motivate them, that's a green light to manipulate them because you still need them to do what you need them to do. If you feel bad about manipulating somebody, you are not going to do well in the intelligence world.
How might so you said the ideology is the strongest of the four of the core motivations. How might you go about finding out someone's ideology in the context of business and life?
A lot of times people will volunteer it to you. There's two ways. If you're a keen observer, people will volunteer it to you. You've already volunteered that you are ideologically predisposed to fatherhood. You've already talked about it. The reason that you're worried about fucking up your kids that you don't even have yet is because you're thinking about fatherhood. So clearly you are ideologically predisposed to what it means to be a responsible father. You want to be seen as a responsible father. Mm-hmm. That plays into your ego as well. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure when you're talking to your partner, if you guys are already looking at where would we go to school? Where would we live? What kind of diapers should we use? If you're even thinking about that, you're thinking about it through the lens of the ideology of being an engaged, present, helpful, loving father, right? So people will volunteer it. Your customer base will volunteer to you what their ideologies are. They'll volunteer their politics. They'll volunteer their pain from their childhood. They'll volunteer their pain from business.
If you listen.
If you listen. The second way that you can get to understand the ideology of your customer base is through active marketing, the right kind of marketing, not mass marketing, not the kind of garbage that you see on Instagram and YouTube about, how to make people believe in your brand because you use the right colors, but actual marketing where you present a message and that message was crafted with an emotion behind it. People who respond to that intentionally crafted message are showing what their motivations are because they were clearly motivated enough by the message to take action. You've heard a lot of people talk about narrative, especially in politics. There's the liberal narrative, and there's the Republican narrative, and there's the conservative narrative, and the church narrative. And people talk a lot about narrative. Narrative is not the power in influence. The power in influence actually comes from messaging. It takes two steps to get to a narrative. It takes messaging first, and then messaging builds a narrative. If you think about messaging, messaging is supposed to be an emotional thing. Just a statement, just a message, just like a text message, right? Are you afraid of being the kind of father that isn't present for your kids? That creates emotion in the right, ideologically predisposed person. There's no woman out there who's going to be motivated by that. She might be motivated to tell her partner about that, but it's not going to resonate with her like it resonates with me as a father of young children. But that's just the message. Then the narrative is not emotional in nature. The narrative is logical in nature. So you use an emotional message to communicate a logical narrative. Are you afraid of being the kind of father that's not present for your child? Oh man, that pulls at my heartstrings. Well, then all you have to do is sign up for this app that reminds you every Sunday to read your kids a story. And you're like, oh, that makes total sense. All I need is a reminder and I'm going to be a good dad. And that's messaging and narrative. The same thing happens in politics. The same thing happens in geopolitics. The same thing happens the whole world over. Because in the intelligence world, we understand messaging and narrative. We know how to use messaging and narrative. It's how you elect a president. It's the reason that Saudi Arabia went to war with Iran over Yemen. Like it's everybody understands at a national security level the idea of creating a message or a narrative using emotional messaging. But when it comes to business, people don't get it yet. They haven't learned that lesson yet because they've all been taught through an MBA program or something else that you sell toothpaste by creating more toothpaste with brighter colors on more shelves.
As mães são responsáveis pela maior parte da educação dos filhos. Devem amá-los, cuidá-los e tratá-los como realmente devem ser tratados. Mas, e quando a sua mãe é sociopata? Você conseguiria realmente perceber se ela fosse sociopata? Eu acho que não. Eu também não sabia que a mãe do meu amigo de infância, chamado Jorge na época, era sociopata. Até ouvir esse agente da CIA revelar esses segredos ultra secretos ensinados pelos espiões da CIA para detectar uma ameaça natural. E sabias que um dos requisitos importantes para se tornar um espião é que você precisa vir de uma família sociopata? André Bultamonte é o oficial reformado da CIA, que usa habilidades de espião para ensinar qualquer pessoa a dominar a sua mente e os seus talentos na vida e nos negócios. Já falamos sobre a arte que os espiões da CIA usam para manipular qualquer pessoa. Agora é a vez de aprender sobre como detectar um sociopata. Estás preparado?
What were the needs that were going unmet in your life at that point?
I did not feel loved. Growing up, I did not feel loved. My mother loved me, and I know logically and rationally that she loved me. But my mother was a cold woman. She was focused on career success. She was focused on feminism. She was focused on other things. I as an adult now, my sisters and I often reflect on the fact that we think our mom was the kind of woman that didn't want to be a mom, but it was expected of her to be a mom. So therefore she became a mom. So there wasn't a lot of love. There wasn't a lot of emotional support. There was plenty of academic support. And it was always hard because the academic support came, I think, as a way of making sure that they didn't have to provide the other support. Because if you have an academically successful student who turns 18, they can get the fuck out of the house and you can have your life back. And I think that was the mission for my mom, was just academic success, be successful so I don't have to take care of you, because I'm not really good at this whole hugging, loving thing. And I just want you gone. So I feel like that was my mom. My dad and my mom, I think, had a marriage that was based in a common set of objectives, more so than shared love. And they were just kind of pursuing those objectives. And I was fortunate because from that, I was cultivated to be a hardworking academic success. And that led to a full ride scholarship, and that led to, success in other parts of life. But for sure, it left behind a trail of always wondering who loves me in my family. Is love even important in a family? Does it matter? Or am I being too focused on this whole love thing? As an example, I tell this story because it's totally normal to me, but a lot of other people find it surprising. There was a day where my mom pulled me aside. I was having an argument with my stepdad, and I went to my mom looking for support, and I asked her to support me. I was like, do you love me, right? Do you love me, or do you love dad more? And she looked at me and she was like, of course I love your dad more than I love you, because you're my son. I have to love you. You were born to me. I must love you, but it's a choice to love your dad. So I have to love him more because it's a choice. And for me, I will never forget that conversation. I'll never forget the look on my mom's face. It was so simple and so academic and so clear to her. And it's never been something I could ever actually accept. And even now, as a husband and a father myself, I don't understand how that was logically sound to her. I don't know how you could ever actually prioritize who you love.
All of that, as you've said, as the result, resulted in your academic success and your focus and all of those kinds of things. But at what cost?
I mean, it makes you kind of fucked up, man. It makes you feel like, first of all, it makes you feel like your secrets are justified. It makes you feel like you must have secrets because there's nobody that you can talk to about certain things. I remember for many years, you can't take your love life to mom and dad. You can't tell them the girl that you think is cute. You can't talk to them about not getting picked to go to the prom dance or anything like that. You can't talk about that with them because they don't care. And you can't trust your sisters. You can't trust your mom. You can't trust your dad. You can't trust the people in your own house. So because you can't trust them and because you can't take certain things to them, you must keep secrets. And since you must keep secrets, you must be allowed to keep secrets. There must be secrets that are totally acceptable that they are also keeping from you. So I grew up in a world where secrets were something that was very normal. And then from that, you start to learn that if secrets are normal, then lying must also be normal and totally acceptable. So there's a level of sociopathy that develops when you feel like you're on your own. And that's something that most people out there who are loners, who have grown up in that world, they learn to understand that there are certain elements of social behavior that are not culturally acceptable, but as long as you don't talk about them, you can practice them. So that's a big part of what I learned personally, was that secrets, how to keep secrets, that secrets are normal, how to lie without being caught, and more importantly, that there is a very real difference between the people who are raised in a world where they trust people, they trust others, and because they trust others, they have a built-in vulnerability, a built-in deficiency compared to the people who are raised in a world where they don't trust others. Because when you're raised in a world where you don't trust, you can always learn to trust. But when you're raised in a world where you trust first, it's very difficult to train that person to know when to not trust someone else.
How do you feel about that wiring that you have because of that experience?
I mean, it's sad. I'm doing everything in my power to not wire my children the same way that I was wired. So I do believe that there is a faulty wiring that happened. But at the same time, it's been very valuable to me. It's been very productive and valuable in terms of what I've been able to experience, what I've been able to see and do financially, economically, relationally. I benefit and value. And this is a big challenge that I have, is as much as I sit here telling friends, and like I'm telling you, secrets, because this is what happens. We tell people secrets when they trust you. When I share with you the challenges of growing up, it's important to me that I don't sound like I'm complaining or whining, because I had a fantastic foundation for success after that. But I defined success in all the ways that I was trained to define success: financially, economically, empirically, not based on how I feel internally.
A sociopatia é basicamente a dificuldade que um indivíduo tem de sentir emoções por outras pessoas, ou até mesmo sentir empatia por outras pessoas, que é literalmente o seu inimigo número 1, a empatia. Se você se identificou com alguns comportamentos que a mãe de André teve, você sendo diagnosticado medicamente como sociopata ou não, por favor, faça uma reanálise sobre tudo o que você diz para as pessoas, porque isso pode não machucar a você, mas machuca a outra pessoa com certeza. O conselho que eu dou aqui hoje é que sejamos todos mais humildes e empáticos uns com os outros, pois a sociedade realmente está chorando nos dias de hoje por isso.
One day I found myself 100 feet underground, miserable. It's a horrible job.
As bombas nucleares são consideradas como as armas mais perigosas do mundo, pois um simples botão pode acabar com milhares de vidas num piscar de olhos. O conhecimento de como elas são produzidas e onde são armazenadas é realmente um arquivo extra confidencial. Pelo menos era isso que eu pensava, até que essa gente da CIA reformado decidiu abrir a boca.
When I was a nuclear missile officer, you sit in a launch control capsule, an LCC, that sits 100 feet underground. And you sit there on a 72-hour shift with one other person, the other person who holds the other key. And then you are one nuclear crew of maybe 30 different nuclear crews who are all on deployment at the same time. And your whole job is just to sit there and wait for nuclear war to break out. Even right now, as you and I are having this conversation, there are some 200 Americans sitting underground doing that exact job. And that's just in the United States.
Mas, alguma vez pelo menos já te passou pela cabeça como os Estados Unidos da América controlam suas bombas nucleares? Basta mesmo apenas um telefonema para lançar os seus poderosos mísseis como vemos nos filmes? André Bustamonte é um oficial reformado da CIA, que usa as suas habilidades de espião treinados pela própria CIA para ensinar qualquer pessoa a dominar a sua mente e conseguir sucesso na vida e nos negócios. No nosso último episódio falamos sobre a técnica secreta que os espiões da CIA usam para detectar indivíduos sociopatas. Desta vez, vamos aprender sobre como os Estados Unidos da América controlam suas próprias bombas nucleares. Vamos lá.
Is that when we are recruited into intelligence service, specifically when CIA recruits field operators, it's fairly transparent. They tell you that you were recruited because you are a little fucked up. They tell you that you were recruited because of a certain psychological profile that makes it so that you pragmatically view things like secrets and lies. There's a few different terms. We call it moral flexibility. Depending on the situation, there are some things that I would deem immoral, but to do them in a different situation is totally acceptable. And that's just something that I'm wired to be, that's been wired in me since I was a kid, but CIA understands how to take advantage of that, how to use that in a way that benefits American national security. There's also an element of high performance that comes from being wired a certain way. So there is a tie between childhood trauma and high performance. It's a documented connection, but CIA has learned, as has MI6 and Mossad and all the other intelligence services of the world, they've learned that when you train someone who has just the right amount of childhood trauma high performance, when you get your hands on them at the right time in the right period of their life, they can be trained to become extremely loyal, highly productive field operators that end up spending 30 plus years in service to their nation.
When did they get their hands on you?
They recruited me when I was 27 years old, coming out of the military in 2007. I was looking for whatever the next step was going to be. And that was when I was approached by a CIA recruiter.
I heard that you got a pop-up on your computer screen.
Yeah, back in the day, I was actually applying. I was a nuclear missile officer for the CIA, I was a nuclear missile officer for the Air Force. And a nuclear missile officer in the Air Force controls nuclear ICBMs. So I wore the little ring.
Wait. What's a nuclear ICBM?
So a nuclear ICBM is a nuclear intercontinental ballistic missile. So the large missiles that carry nuclear warheads for mutually assured destruction, nuclear war type of stuff.
So you controlled the nuclear missiles?
I was half of who controlled them. I wore one ring, somebody else wore a different ring, and that was how a nuclear missile got launched.
What does the ring do? So
the ring is a key. On the end of it is a key. And when you get a nuclear code that comes in, the code, you put it into an old school computer system, and the two of you take your key ring and you insert it into the silo operating system. And then you turn in unison. And when you turn in unison, it launches a nuclear weapon.
How did you get yourself to the point in life at 27 years old where you're holding a nuclear key around your neck?
I would love to say it was a series of good decisions, but it wasn't. I did what I was told. That's how I got there. I did what I was told when I was in high school, and I got good grades. And then my mom told me that the best school of all the universities that chose me, the best school I should go to is the Air Force Academy. So then I accepted a full ride scholarship to the United States Air Force Academy, where I did what I was told, and I graduated as a lieutenant. And then I followed what the Air Force told me to do from there. And they told me to learn how to fly. And then they told me that they needed me to work in nuclear and space weapons instead. So then I went to that school and I did well at that school. And I ended up just kind of climbing the ladder. I did what I was told. And then one day I found myself 100 feet underground, miserable. It's a horrible job.
Why?
So in 2007, when I was a nuclear missile officer, you sit in a launch control capsule, an LCC, that sits 100 feet underground. And you sit there on a 72-hour shift with one other person, the other person who holds the other key. And then you are one nuclear crew of maybe 30 different nuclear crews who are all on deployment at the same time. So at any given time, in one Air Force base, there's 60-ish people underground for 72 hours at a time. And then in a different missile base, there'll be a different 60 people underground. And your whole job is just to sit there and wait for a nuclear war to break out. And obviously nuclear war hasn't broken out, and hopefully it never will break out. So as you sit there underground, not seeing sunlight, and as you sit there in a capsule with one other person that you very rarely ever like, you have a lot of time to reflect on what am I doing? What am I doing with my life? I'm a redundancy of a scenario that we all are working very hard to make sure never happens. Is this a productive life? Like, am I making a difference? Am I leaving a mark in history, sitting here, not launching missiles, waiting for a message to come in that I already know isn't going to lead to nuclear war? It's a very difficult and thankless job that even right now, as you and I are having this conversation, there are some 200 Americans sitting underground doing that exact job. And that's just in the United States. Every country that has nuclear weapons is doing the same thing.
If an order had come in that instructed you to launch a nuclear weapon, would you have done it?
Absolutely. That's what you do. The other thing that's important to understand is we're redundancies of redundancies. So we don't know if an order says to launch nuclear weapons. We just know that an order comes in that says to insert the keys and turn them. And if it's a valid order that comes in, then the machine will let us insert our keys, we will turn our keys, and then the machine will do what the machine does. Sometimes that order that's coming in is saying launch nuclear missiles. Sometimes that order that's coming in is just a drill to make sure that the two people in the capsule turn their keys.
Oh, really? So you never know the difference?
We're just a redundancy of a redundancy, man.
It seems hard to me to understand how someone would stay in that job for a long period of time. So they must have like really high attrition.
They have shockingly low attrition because they do such a good job of psychologically identifying the right people for that job.
Were they scouting you, do you think, from a very early age to eventually go into the CIA?
No, I don't believe so. I think CIA is far too practical to do anything that requires scouting people from a young age. I think what more realistically happened is that they had a very simple algorithm that they had applied to every government website so that when people of a certain profile applied to a job on a government website, then they'd get a flash on their screen, just like I did, that said, hey, we appreciate your application. We'd like to have a different recruiter contact you for a different opportunity.
What were you applying for on that government website when that pop-up came up?
Yeah, I was applying for the Peace Corps. I was trying to get into the US Peace Corps because after spending 2 years underground waiting to launch nuclear missiles, I thought that it'd be great to get out of the Air Force and go do the exact opposite. Kind of like if you've ever had a really bad breakup, you go looking for the exact opposite of the person you just broke up with. That's how I felt.
Faz todo sentido te admitir em seus testes quando você já está psicologicamente preparado desde pequeno com problemas de uma família não saudável. E acho meio injusto, mas eficaz, que eles utilizam essas dores, treinam essas dores e transformam como uma arma para determinarem seus próprios fins. 1000 vezes controlar os seus problemas para que te ajudem a determinar os seus fins ou seu propósito na vida, do que ser controlado por eles e não se tornar nada na vida só porque você está sendo perturbado pelos seus próprios problemas. Afinal de contas, eles te ensinam a dominá-los e não ser dominados por eles. Eu acho isso um ponto positivo nesse contexto e temos muita coisa a aprender com eles por causa disso.
Bad liars talk a lot. Good liars talk a little. Because the more you talk, the more you run the risk of undermining your own lie. Bad liars make a lot of statements. Good liars ask a lot of questions. Because if you ask questions, you're not really disclosing anything about yourself.
A mentira é uma habilidade muito poderosa. Muitas vezes, elas são utilizadas para esconder uma verdade muito delicada para não ferir as pessoas. Mas, outras vezes, elas são utilizadas como armas contra indivíduos inocentes que procuram soluções para seus próprios problemas. Muitos dizem que para descobrir se uma pessoa está mentindo, basta apenas fazer uma pequena pergunta e prestar atenção nos seus olhos. Se ele olhar para a direita, estará mentindo, pois o lado direito é onde fica o mecanismo do cérebro para gerar criatividade. E se olhar para a esquerda, é onde essa pessoa está dizendo a verdade, porque é aí que fica o mecanismo do cérebro para lembrar das coisas uma vez vividas. Bom, pelo menos eu pensava dessa maneira, até que esse espião da CIA revelou algo muito chocante.
If you remember ever going to a party or ever having a date or ever being in a social environment where there was somebody there that made you feel so interesting, but you didn't know anything about them, you were talking to a very good liar.
André Bustamonte é um oficial reformado da CIA que usa as suas diversas habilidades como espião treinado rigorosamente pela CIA para ensinar qualquer pessoa a dominar a sua mente e conseguir sucesso na vida e nos negócios. No nosso último episódio, falamos sobre como os Estados Unidos controlam suas armas nucleares. Desta vez, vamos aprender sobre como descobrir um mentiroso. Estás preparado?
How do they teach someone how to lie?
It starts with a foundation of making sure that you recruit people who are already liars. And then when you're sitting across from a liar, you can start to understand if they're a good liar or not very quickly. You've probably talked to people who are bad liars.
Yeah. Let's talk to everything. Yeah.
So you know when someone's a bad liar. So from that, you can identify people who are good liars. And then when you do find a good liar, you start to teach them what they already naturally do that makes them a good liar. And then you start to teach them how to refine that skill. And you start to teach them how bad liars operate and how you can detect a bad liar and how you gain advantages, with lies and how to handle lies. As an example, because I promised you skills, bad liars talk a lot. Good liars talk a little. Because the more you talk, the more you run the risk of undermining your own lie. Bad liars make a lot of statements. Good liars ask a lot of questions. Because if you ask questions, you're not really disclosing anything about yourself. So if you think back and if you remember ever going to a party or ever having a date or ever being in a social environment where there was somebody there that made you feel so interesting, but you didn't know anything about them, you were talking to a very good liar.
What about body language? Is that a factor in lying?
Absolutely. I mean, body language is a factor in everything, but body language is especially a factor in lying because, again, going back to the idea of a skilled liar versus an unskilled liar, a skilled liar knows how to appear like they are telling the truth with their words and with their body, whereas an unskilled liar often has a disconnect, and their body will say a different message than what their mouth is saying. Consider your stereotypical jock, your standard European footballer or your American jock. A lot of times they'll be portrayed as like somebody who they sit bigger than life and all this other stuff, right? Their body shows confidence and openness. But then when they talk, they sound like idiots, right? Totally, like, dude, that lady, like, whatever. There's a disconnect. Their voice does not demonstrate the same confidence that their body demonstrates. So you know that person is lying. What they're lying about is not necessarily just the content of what they're saying, but they recognize they can't cognitively accept the fact that they are in a position where they are telling an untruth. And that untruth at a minimum is that they are not super confident and super comfortable. They are actually uncomfortable and they are not feeling confident. And that's why they're stammering over themselves.
So when you were lying to someone, based on your training, would you think a lot about your body language?
Yes.
And what would you do? What were the principles of making sure your body language wasn't letting the cat out of the bag, per se?
So one of the first things to do when you're trying to lie to somebody, and again, we're now talking about how to lie to somebody. You shouldn't want to learn how to lie to somebody. You should want to learn how to know if somebody is lying to you. Mm-hmm. But we always start this way where we're afraid to ask the real question, which is how do I know if I'm being lied to? Because that shows vulnerability. But if you want to learn how to lie to somebody, the first thing you do is you mimic the person. Look at you and I right now. We are mirrored. Mm. Are your hands connected under the table?
Yeah.
So are mine. Are your feet crossed under your seat?
Yeah.
So are mine. We are mirrored right now, which means when you look at me subconsciously, you see yourself. Mm. I want you to see yourself in this exercise because if you see yourself, your initial instinctive response is going to be trust. Because who do you trust in the whole world? You trust yourself. So the first step to being able to lie effectively is to be able to mirror the person you're lying to. If I was coming at you like, right away, you're going to be like, I don't know who this guy is, right? And similarly, if I was to be like,
just for people that are on audio, he's just like doing different postures and body languages. So that are far away from my own, like putting his hands on the table, etc. So, okay, makes sense.
So we want to mirror first. And you mirror because mirroring creates a foundation of trust. Subconsciously, it creates a foundation of trust. And then once you have that foundation of trust, you just start kind of pushing the envelope more and more with the untruth or with the fabrication that you're creating, the lie, right?
Is there anything else on the subject of telling a lie to someone that's believable that we need to be aware of in terms of skills?
Yes. So first, the whole idea about there's two important ideas that get glorified in social media that are just inaccurate. And the first is called eye movements. You can't actually tell if somebody's lying to you based on where they place their eyes. Because While there are certain elements of eye movements that have biological relevancy, there's many, many more things about eye movements that don't have biological relevancy, right? So what I mean by that is, if I ask you, what's your oldest memory? You just look to your left. It's natural to look to your left when you're from a Western country because chronologically, timelines start on the left. So when you ask somebody a question about time and they look to the left, up, down, or in the middle, generally speaking, that has biological relevancy. So it's a low probability that they're lying, but they still could be lying. When you ask somebody a question, they look to the upper right or the lower right or wherever they might look. If there's not necessarily biological relevancy because they could be looking up and to the right because down and to the left, it's too bright. And they could be looking in any number of directions because maybe they have, a headache or maybe they have something else going on. The ability to create some sense of probability about why they're making the eye movements they're making is too difficult. So you can't assess someone's honesty or dishonesty based off of eye movements, even though you're going to hear that you can from Instagram influencers and Discord and everywhere on the internet. You're going to hear that there's some connection that you can make justifiably. It's not true. The same thing is also true. So it is also an untruth that you can rely on something known as micro expressions. Micro expressions being the number of times your eyes blink or the twitch in your face, or if you're sucking on your lips, these ideas that get glorified through social media as indicators of deceit. The truth is, you don't know if someone is lying to you until you have had enough time with the person to establish what's known as a baseline. A baseline means what's normal for you. So I'll just use you as an example. 10 minutes before the cameras turned on, you were a totally different person. Your energy is different. You're so much more conversational. Like you're an awesome, friendly guy when the cameras are not on. But you turn into an interviewer when the cameras turn on. Totally rational, totally logical, makes total sense. That doesn't mean that you're lying now and you were telling the truth then. It means that the environment has changed and nobody would know that if there wasn't a baseline. Most people that watch you don't ever know what you're like outside of this baseline.
So you have to get to know the person and then understand the variance that's unusual to understand if they're lying to you.
Exactly. We call it time on target. You need time on target so that you can understand the delta, the change between their baseline and whatever pressure you're putting them under.
Was there any sort of consistent telltale signs that someone was lying to you in an interaction? Like, you know what I mean? Certain, nervous things that they do change, what are those variances that you might see that you go, this person's now lying to me?
Yeah. So with unskilled liars, it becomes much easier. Because a lot of times with skilled liars, with people who have either learned how to lie through formal training or people who have learned how to lie through the school of hard knocks, when there's people who are skilled liars, it's difficult to find generic tells. With people who are unskilled liars, it's much easier to find generic tells. There are people who you've heard of being on the hot seat. It's a phrase we use in Western culture pretty often. Like when someone is under pressure, we call them being in a hot seat. When you've got an unskilled liar, they can't stop moving their body. Like they're always uncomfortable and they just keep moving and they keep twitching and they keep fidgeting. And it's like they're sitting in a hot seat. That is one of the biggest tells of an unskilled liar. And again, anybody who's ever had like a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old try to lie to them, they know what that looks like. They can't make eye contact. They do a lot of like verbal noises that aren't actual words. They can't get comfortable. They keep moving around. They keep shifting. Shifty. Those are all those words came from real world examples of an unskilled liar trying to lie. But you don't need micro expressions of the face or to know which way their eyes are tracking in order to pick up on that. 90% of the people out there, they're all trapped in their own perception. They're all trapped in thinking emotionally. They don't even know that there's an alternative. Just think about this, man. The conversation we're having right now, the people who are hearing this conversation right now, who have never heard that there's a difference between perception and perspective, are already better equipped than all the other assholes who have never heard this conversation.
Os espiões da CIA muitas vezes são vistas como pessoas diretas, prontas para qualquer confronto e preparados para qualquer tipo de problema, independentemente do problema. São verdadeiros símbolos de coragem e determinação, pois eles chegam mesmo a se infiltrar em organizações mais perigosas do mundo em busca de informações confidenciais que ajudam a acabar com a mesma organização. Esses trabalhos não são para qualquer um, pois demanda de muito treinamento e força de vontade para fazer isso. Pelo menos é isso que eu pensava até que esse espião da CIA revelou algo que me deixou totalmente espantado.
The first is immediately distrust your emotions. Know right away when you're feeling emotions. In other words, what I'm saying is don't trust your gut, which is the antithesis of what most people tell you to do. Most people say trust your gut. I'm telling you right now, your gut is more often than not lying to you.
André Bustamonte é um oficial reformado da CIA que usa as suas diversas habilidades como espião treinado rigorosamente pela CIA para ensinar qualquer pessoa a dominar a sua mente e conseguir sucesso na vida e nos negócios. No nosso último episódio, esse agente nos ensinou como identificar um perfeito mentiroso. Desta vez, vamos aprender sobre como treinar o seu cérebro para ir atrás dos seus objetivos e conseguir sucesso na vida e nos negócios. Estás preparado?
CIA then taught me what you're seeing is actually the world as it really is. And let's train you to show you and give you a vocabulary to understand what you're seeing. Let's teach you about human psychology so you understand why it works the way that it works, why everybody sees it and nobody talks about it, right? So that was my first big aha moment. And then my second big aha moment came when I left CIA and I was unemployed for like 6 months living in my in-laws' converted garage with a 1-year-old child, wondering how the fuck I did so many things so wrong that I couldn't get a job, even though I was just part of the CIA. And in that time, feeling like just the world's biggest loser, the only skill that I could lean on was what the CIA had taught me to do. So then I lied my way into a Fortune 10 company, and all of a sudden, I wasn't a loser anymore. And once I realized that I could use CIA skills to succeed in business, that was my second big aha moment. So now, everything I see through a lens of CIA skills in a business world.
Perception versus perspective was one of the other things that I've heard you talk about. Was quite a big, I guess, shift in understanding, but something that the regular person doesn't really understand.
Yeah, so the idea of perception and perspective, I have to define them first, right? Perception is what you believe you see. Where you sit is how you perceive the world around you. Perspective is how other people see where you're sitting. So when I think about us right now across the table from each other, my perception is what I see of you. Your perspective is very different than my perception, right? At a minimum, I'm looking at you with a background that's different than when you're looking at me with a background. So the benefit, the advantage that CIA gives its field officers is that it trains us to recognize and distrust our perception, because perception really only comes from one source, and that is your own 5 senses. You are the source of information for your perception. So for anybody who's ever seen like a little pile of socks in the lower left-hand corner and they thought it was a rat and they jump until they realize it's socks, that is your perception lying to you. Perspective means that you get data objectively from the world around you. So if you're in your room and you see a pile of black in the corner, your perspective tells you, this is your room. There's never been a rat in your room ever before. That pile in the corner is probably something like socks. Your perspective keeps things objective. Perception makes things very subjective or very emotional. So CIA trains us to lean into our perspective, gain perspective, think about things objectively, because if you lean on your perception, you're leaning on emotions, and emotions are very likely wrong.
How can I train myself to lean more on my perspective?
There's 2 really quick things that you can do. The first is immediately distrust your emotions. Know right away when you're feeling emotions. In other words, what I'm saying is don't trust your gut, which is the antithesis of what most people tell you to do. Most people say trust your gut. I'm telling you right now, your gut is more often than not lying to you, because your gut is based in emotion. Your girlfriend's not about to dump you. Your boyfriend isn't cheating on you. You're not about to go bankrupt. Nobody cares about the zit on your nose, right? That is most likely true. There's a small chance that your perception is correct, but when it comes to gambling, are you going to bet on the small chance or the bigger chance? You should always gamble on the bigger chance. The bigger chance you only really understand through perspective. If you have perspective on something, then you have multiple data points on something. So when you feel yourself getting emotional, stop and let your emotion happen for a second, right? I feel nervous. I feel anxious. I feel doubtful. Okay. I probably don't have to. You probably shouldn't, because whoever's sitting across the table from you, whoever's coming into the room with you, whoever else is on the bus with you, they are all focused on 1,000 different things. And the things that they're focused on most likely don't include you.
Sounds easier said than done.
Correct.
Is that a process of repetitions to train yourself to think like that?
It is. It takes momentum. So what ends up having to happen is that you need to exercise it intentionally at first. And what happens is, as you intentionally exercise your perspective over perception, what will start to happen is you will start to see that what you were worried about doesn't happen. And then once you see it not happen, once you see your perspective give you the correct information over your perception, once you see that happen once, then it starts to gain momentum. And then it happens again, and it gains more momentum and more momentum and more momentum until the time comes that you realize it's much easier. But it's a learned skill. You have to learn to think objectively instead of subjectively, think rationally instead of emotionally. And a big part of what helps you do that is understanding that 90% of the people out there, they're all trapped in their own perception. They're all trapped in thinking emotionally. They don't even know that there's an alternative. Just think about this, man. The conversation we're having right now, the people who are hearing this conversation right now, who have never heard that there's a difference between perception and perspective, are already better equipped than all the other assholes who have never heard this conversation. They're already one step ahead of their competition. They're one step ahead of their spouses, their partners, their bullies. They're one step ahead of everybody, because now they can use the words perception and perspective, subjective and objective, emotional and logical and rational. They can use these words to define how they want to think, even if they don't think that way yet. That's the huge advantage to what CIA calls the trained and the untrained. Trained people at least are aware that there's an alternative option. Untrained people aren't even aware that there's an option. The vast majority of people out there are what I call bobbleheads. They don't even know there's an option. They're completely unaware of an alternative solution, an alternative process. So they're trapped in their perception. They're trapped in their emotion. They're trapped in their subjectivity. And that makes it so much easier for people like you and me and everyone listening right now to use rational, objective perspective to get those people to do whatever we want them to do.
Galera, é sempre necessária uma boa análise de todo o acontecimento ao seu redor. Deepak Chopra, no seu livro Os 7 Princípios da Realização Pessoal, fala sobre milagres estarem sempre acontecendo, desde que nós prestemos atenção a eles. A percepção nesse contexto tem muito a ver com o que nos é entregue pelas convenções do momento, galera, e não necessariamente no âmbito geral, que neste caso o André Bustamonte classificou como perspectiva. Por exemplo, tem uma história de um camponês, e quem souber contar melhor essa história, por favor, conte nos comentários, tá? Então, esse camponês tinha um filho, e esse mesmo filho, ainda jovem, havia caído do cavalo e partido a perna. O camponês havia entrado em desespero, lamentando e perguntando todos os santos dias o porquê aquilo ter acontecido com seu filho, que o destino não estava no seu lado e etc. Nessa mesma semana, o seu reino entrou em guerra, e os soldados do rei vieram até o seu bairro e levaram todos os jovens daquele mesmo bairro para ajudar na guerra. Porém, não levaram seu filho por ser deficiente. Mais tarde, eles ouviram que todos os jovens que haviam sido levados, todos haviam morrido na guerra, e que aquele jovem era o único jovem daquele mesmo bairro que tinha restado, neste caso, por não ter ido à guerra. Quando nós analisamos acontecimentos num âmbito assim um pouco mais geral, nós conseguimos realmente ver de uma perspectiva diferente, porque nós só vemos o acontecimento e não vemos o resultado em si. O meu conselho aqui hoje é que vocês comecem a prestar mais atenção nos resultados em vez dos acontecimentos em si, pois eles podem ser uma única gota no oceano infinito.